I welcome up the Prime Minister. Here.
Can I be heard? Cool. In terms of POIs in chat would be great. And if I haven't taken one by 5:45, just unmute yourself. Cool. Okay. Three, two. Panel, first simple push from OG today is just that this is incredibly exclusionary to immigrants. When your national identity primarily surrounds collective shared grief that happened within your country, this means that people who come into your country just don't have the same level of relatability and cannot integrate as well. I want to firstly start by framing what this shared grief and what this collective sacrifice actually looks like. I think this oftentimes looks like a former colonized country who looks at like their colonizer as like their enemy, who looks at like this terrible event that happened where a country invaded their country, took over land, treated the people like shit essentially. And I think this is then like a type of shared grief that exists. I think this also exists with things like world wars, like maybe France's like a battle with Germany and that sort of thing. I think these are like the biggest national issues that most people who are from that country can relate to. So these are likely to be the things that are talked about. I think this how this actually plays out is like political leaders talking about this as like the country's primary national identity, other people from other countries recognizing and knowing about this issue because the people in the country talk about it so much. Why does this exclude immigrants? First reason, obviously, as an immigrant coming into a country, your ancestors just simply didn't grow up there. You might not have grown up there if you're a first generation immigrant. So you just simply don't have the same experience as the people who live in this country. So you cannot share in this collective grief. You cannot like try and claim to understand as much as the people who live there, try and like go about it in an empathetic way because the people that live there will simply recognize you as an outsider and see that you do not have the same experience. Secondly, often the event involves some sort of foreign enemy, and this is much worse for you as an immigrant if you are from the foreign country, which this country has had issues with in the past. I think this means like people just viewing you as the same as your ancestors, and we see this play out in like right-wing culture where people make generalizations about different groups of people based on one experience with one group of people at a certain point in time, and they then make generalizations and assume that everyone from that place is like that. So I think that like this often involves an enemies, especially if the immigrants are from that country, they're likely to view these people the same way. Thirdly, I think that this is just inherently inaccessible for immigrants. There is zero way for them to take part in this form of national identity, even if they have been, if they're like a fifth generation immigrant, they've lived in this country for decades. I think that like the fact that this is something that happened in the past makes it incredibly and inherently inaccessible to them. They will never be able to experience the shared grief. They will never be able to experience it. And fourthly, just kind of on the same thing, these people just look different to the people that live in the country. They could be like a different race. They're from a different country. They likely just look different. So I think that this kind of like almost exposes them as somebody who doesn't have this shared collective grief, and will like they'll kind of stick out as somebody who cannot relate to these things. And fifthly, I think this just like within the country breeds hostility towards outsiders in general. What is like the actual impact here? I think it makes it incredibly easy to exclude immigrants because they cannot relate. How does this actually play out? I think this plays out in like conversations between people within that country. I think it plays out in like social situations. I think it plays out culturally in the way that people view people coming in from outside their countries. They will always view them as like somewhat less than them if they try and live there because they will say, you do not have this shared collective experience. You cannot claim the same level of national identity as we can, no, like regardless of how long you've lived there. Secondly, I think it's also likely for these people to kind of view these immigrants as like not a real member of this country. You didn't experience the sacrifice. You're not the same as us. And thirdly, I think this is
Do
like
I?
fuels right-wing unrest. I said in the chat, this fuels right-wing unrest, which unfairly frames migrants as the problem. Like people who are extremist right wingers just want like to find some sort of scapegoat and find some sort of excuse in order to like express this anger and violence that they want to express. So it's very easy for them to use something like this and use the fact that migrants just cannot relate as a reason to exclude them. On the counterfactual, I think that like national identity is just more likely to surround much more positive aspects of the country. Why is this? Firstly, because I think positive aspects such as like cultural things like art and like parades that happen within that country are a lot more accessible, or sorry, almost are honestly more accessible than like the historic this history of that country, because I think that these are things that still currently happen, that the country like still promotes within their social and cultural atmosphere and this sort of thing, so they're accessible. Secondly, I think that like this is still a cultural thing that is inherent to these people's nationality, so they still get this kind of like nationalistic aspect without it being so inherently negative. And thirdly, like these things are just simply enjoyable. Like in Ireland, it's very easy to like pick up a fiddle and engage in traditional Irish music. It's very easy to like go to a pride parade and engage in this sort of thing. It's very easy to go to a St. Patrick's parade and like it's very enjoyable. Can you tell these are all Irish examples? Oh, I wonder where I'm from. But like this is just very, very enjoyable for people. And just to like scale this affects for the reasons I said earlier, like first generation immigrants, second generation, so on. Like it affects all immigrants because they look different to the people in these countries, and also they just have a different history that people will know about if you talk to them for more than 5 minutes. You know what I mean? Secondly, it's already much harder for immigrants to integrate into a country because they're already not from there. It's already harder for them to like get used to different cultural and social norms, to find jobs and this sort of thing, like messing around with visas and all that. So I think this just like impacts them a lot more because they are more marginalized groups. Even like if it doesn't impact that many of them, it's still a very severe impact. I will take a POI from closing, please.
As an Irish person, why is it more likely that the alternative is cultural parades and not, say, religion, language, ethnic identity, historical tensions and grievances, etc.?
But because like for the reasons that I said, I think that these things are incredibly enjoyable. I think people want to engage in them. I think they're very accessible to people. I also don't think like it's that bad of a thing if people engage in like the language as well, learn a new skill. Like this isn't a negative thing. And cool, victim complex. Why? This is a second push from us. Why is a victim complex really bad for like you as an individual and for policy? I think the pitying yourself is bad because when a country as a whole focuses on the negative part of their national identity, this influences how populist politicians come in and try and convince people to vote for them. It limits policy. Why? Because it's very easy for populist politicians to come in and weaponize this group to get support. And why is it bad? Like, why do I think that their policies are likely to be bad? If they're using emotion as their like main way of convincing people to vote for them, it's likely that their policy is not based on like substantive good reasoning and like good impacts on the people. It's likely that this policy is just like, you know, Trump sort of things. It's just based purely on like provocative and emotive messaging. I think that this is bad because then you just get worse policy for the country, and you probably have a country who doesn't really know how to get out of this because they've been entrenched in this grief for so long. Secondly, and the mental impact on like the person who's experiencing this. When things go wrong, your default mindset is just to be negative. Like this is obviously bad because you're just more likely to be entrenched in this negativity. And thirdly, I think this just limits your individual growth because you have this like really pessimistic outlook on life that you probably apply to a lot of other areas of your life instead of focusing on the positive things about your country. I think on the counterfactual, you still have this shared grief, but it's just not the primary thing that you focus on in terms of your national identity. You're more proud of your country. You're more positive about your country. You're able to move on from this grief better, and you probably don't view people as the enemy as easily. This fosters culture and connection for all those reasons. OG.
Right. I thank the PM for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Hello. I would prefer to take my POIs verbally, so please do just like unmute. Forgetting the past doesn't fix the present. It disrespects victims. It makes it more likely that the horrors that other people sacrifice themselves to prevent coming back actually re-emerge. What does grief-based national identity look like, and where does it come from? It looks like holding things like annual memorials that celebrate the lives of individuals who lost their lives in consequential wars, whether against colonial powers or whether in internal conflicts like civil wars or strife. It looks like regular discussions about collective action against these sorts of incursions upon your freedom. But importantly, it looks like recognizing that every single person played a part in the successes and the horrors of the nation's history. Everybody made mistakes. Every single group lost something, regardless of whether you were the person in power or the person being subjugated. Your humanity was disrespected. Your identity was hurt, and that was a harm that happened to you. But importantly, national identity is not set by a committee. It is not set by a government. It comes from action. What does that action look like on opposition? It looks like setting up truth and reconciliation commissions that encourage people to do this kind of community-based reflection. It looks like memorializing dead individuals, putting a huge amount of time and effort into categorizing the ways that individuals lost their lives, what they wanted from their future, and ensuring that their memories live on. It thirdly looks like emphasis placed on the inaction of those who could have prevented horrors from happening. So it isn't just the case that bad things happen because a person was evil. Bad things happen because the majority of the people were unbothered. They didn't act in ways that they could have done to prevent things from happening. And this is how we include everyone. It's not saying that everyone suffered the same, but that everyone had their humanity, their inherent ability to be human, disrespected. Government must regret the creation of these things, because the reason that a lot of these things emerge on the ground is because the national identity makes the people think that they are an important part of the way that they practice their culture. So things like setting up truth and reconciliation commissions on the ground, like pushing for rehabilitative justice, all of these things become so ingrained in people when they become part of the national consciousness that they end up becoming very consequential, and thus people perform them more often. The comparative, as our closing points out, is likely to be a patchwork of things. Probably it looks sometimes like focusing on the future successes of the country rather than the past that you have shared. It also can look like just focusing on the language or other things that bind you together. And I think this is likely to be done badly for a couple of reasons. The first is the majority power in that country is always going to want to like have their own group be preferenced. We think in a world whereby the idea is that everybody suffered in an equal and similar way, even if the actual action was different, I think we avoid this problem. Why is framing with grief much more all-encompassing than any other model the government bench could push? The first is that grief is visceral and universal. We may not have all suffered the same, but we have all suffered. We have all lost people, and people in states have all experienced moments of genuine grief and regret. That is something which is infinitely more universal than feelings like success or culture, because cultural practices differ. People can have success in different ways. Success can also be zero-sum. So insofar as some people are likely to succeed in particular instances, other people are likely to lose out. Grief, as a contrast, is much more universal. We can all understand and relate to the Bosnian woman who cries at the grave of her child who was lost in the Yugoslav wars. On a human level, we relate to that and we understand it. Now, maybe it's uncomfortable. I agree with opening government that it isn't quite as fun as a parade, but national identity often isn't meant to be fun. It's about preventing things that went wrong in the past, and I think this is the way that we do it. Additionally, other alternatives for building different communities are often future-based, so they look to things like the way that a country is going to develop into the future. They focus on things like the Rwandan economic miracle of the 2010s and the present day, rather than talking about the circumstances that allowed for the genocide to happen. And this is where opening government are wildly uncomparative, because unfortunately, when migrants enter into different countries, they are not going to share very many things with the people of the place that they emigrated to. They probably don't share the culture or the language, and maybe they don't want to, so it doesn't actually matter that they didn't share this shared history. But I would posit actually even that shared history is something you can relate to more because of how universal grief and suffering is. So maybe it's the case that you didn't lose a relative in the Bosnian War, but you did lose relatives in like the Sudanese Civil War, for example, and you can understand the ways in which regret and grief and suffering can be informational and formative, how national identities end up being constructed. So probably it is symmetric, but if anything, it's probably a margin to opposition. Before I move on to explain the impacts of this and a slight principal argument, Josh, go for it.
I shouldn't really be pushing a burden onto you, but like, why is this exclusive? Why can I not just have a lot of national memorials that people can celebrate, as opposed to like spend money and frame identity around this?
Yeah, so presumably, if all of the things that I have said are good, and I think truth and reconciliation commissions are good, I should want more of them, and I should want the national identity to be strong enough that people do it independently of the central government instructing them to. I also think that it is very hard to hold two conflicting ideas about what your nation actually is in your head at the same time. So quite hard to have St. Paddy's Day parades, but not talk about the mother and baby homes in Ireland that have like consequential lasting impacts to how women experience the sort of process of giving birth in the country today. What are the impacts of them? Firstly, people from all races, religions, and places can feel accepted and can reflect on the harms that they cause to others, but also the harms that other people will cause to them. This looks like encouraging people to think about the ways in which their own inaction could perpetuate harm against another individual. It doesn't look like saying that everyone's grandparents were evil, but saying that everyone's grandparents turned a blind eye when they should have focused on the problem and should have done something to try and prevent it from happening again. This is very consequential. You just feel more connected to your nationality, you feel safer, you feel more willing to engage with the civic options available to you in engaging with things like voting or campaigning. But secondly, you just like genuinely get better social cohesion. So think about countries that have very good social cohesion between different races and religions. Places like the UK, obviously there are examples of where it goes badly, but on the whole, this is a remarkably successful example of an integrated cultural, different cultural backgrounds. We have built our national identity on things like Blitz spirit, emphasizing the ways that individuals from other places came over and assisted us in our fight against a particular thing, forming our national identity through change and through negotiation of what we thought was our culture and what we thought was our values. When you understand that your stories of the past are treated with respect, you just feel way better. But thirdly, you foster an importance on self-reflection. So people are encouraged to look back and to think about ways that things went wrong in the past, to remember and memorialize those who laid down their lives in sacrifice. And again, maybe this isn't particularly jolly, but it does hammer home to you the consequence of doing things like going to war, of making decisions like bombing other individuals, because you understand how that affected the way that your country was built, and it just fosters an environment in which individuals think more about doing this to other people. Why is this finally then just really, really important for victims and people who currently live in these states? So on their side, you may wish to bury the past, you may wish to forge ahead with a bright and shiny future, but this is really bad for two reasons. The first is consequential. So when the story of your grandmother, who had her child removed from her in a baby home and forcefully was sterilized in places like China or South Korea, Those stories deserve to be heard. They deserve to be listened to. And I think you feel really bad when people think that what your nation is, they celebrate it. They commend those actions that were done against you. They commend the actions that were done against your family and the suffering that caused. But it also means that you're unlikely to talk about the way that history consequentially affects the present day manifestation of that country. So when you don't talk about the horrors of the past, you don't talk about things like the lasting generational trauma of things like the mother and baby homes in Ireland, or of things like the Hutu and Tutsis in Rwanda and the ways that that affects poverty dynamics in Rwanda today. I think you lack an opportunity to do this, or at least you minimize the number of times that you can. But when you have to stand side by side with your neighbor at the memorial march, or you have to participate in a minute silence, you venerate a cultural identity that is built on a recognition that everyone suffered, even if it wasn't in the same way. And secondly, on a principle, we live in a world built by the sacrifice of our others. It is completely principally wrong for us to negate what they did for us to move past what they experienced and to pretend like it didn't matter. Of course it matters, and I think the consequence of recognizing that sacrifice is really important, because we are the side that encourages people to listen to their neighbors, to build the Truth and Reconciliation Commissions, to include migrants when they enter, and to focus on what happened in the past to ensure it doesn't happen again. Very proud opposition.
Right. I thank Ulaw for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up Deputy Prime Minister. Here.
I'll take POIs in chat, please. If I haven't taken one by 5:45, though, feel free to shout out. Okay. 3. When loyalists marched to the streets of Belfast 2 weeks ago, burning down the homes of immigrants, saying that their families didn't die for this, I don't think this is a good part of national identity. I think opening opposition are incredibly uncomparative in this debate. A couple of responses. Firstly, I think you still access things like talking about grief. I think you get access to things like talking about sacrifices. A number of reasons as to why you get those that are not a tipping point and necessary to have it as part of your national identity. 1, I think you just do it because victims probably at the time wanted to talk about this. 2, you have family members who had people who had a sacrifice that they did, who care about that sacrifice and care about what their family members did, who probably want this remembered. Thirdly, you just probably talk about this as history of your country. You talk about many different things in school where you learn about your country. Not all of them are part of your national identity. Or you can talk about how you went through wars, you can talk about how you did all of these things, but they do not uniquely need to be linked to your national identity. No, they can be part of your national identity, but they don't have to be the primary aspect of your national identity. Because that's the burden that opening opposition have to stand over. It is a primary aspect of your national operation identity. But thirdly, I think people just talk about the way in which their country has developed over a large period of time that doesn't necessarily mean it is part of that national identity. So I think on the comparative, I think you do not get this. I think you do not get this level of like. I do not think you lose out on things like commemorating and Truth and Reconciliation committees, because oftentimes the Truth and Reconciliation committees happen after the event or happen close to the event before national identity has had a time to take and shape and to actually work. Comparatively, I don't think you need to actually get any of those on the opposite side. 1, they tell you that grief is something that universally you can all access. 1, pride is something you can all access. Everyone has felt pride when they've seen a family member do something cool, or when their friend finally achieves everything that they've wanted to achieve. Pride is also a universal value. You have pride in things that you really want to do. But no, the way in which you experience grief is incredibly individualistic and different to yourself. We were told that people from Yugoslavia, that someone from Yugoslavia can understand what has happened to them. But no, you can't, because you do not understand the generations of, you do not understand the way in which this happened. This is specific ways in which your country itself was betrayed. You do not understand the grief that happened and the history that goes into this. But also, no, you can never understand this comparatively because you do not have access to like the family members to talk to you about this. Irish people have had massive amounts of grief due to colonialism, but it's a different form of grief. It's a different form of it's a different form of how we went about this. So no, you do not get access to it. But I think on the counterfactual, I think like things like language, I think things like the arts, things like the scenery and the beauty of your country are all things that you can access, because when you come into a country, you can learn the language, you can start to pick up instruments, you can do all of these various different things. Whereas comparatively, the grief, you will never experience that grief, nor will you ever have access to that grief. You will never have access to being able to do that grief. Because even if you think that you understand that grief to a certain extent, you'll always have someone push back on you. Will say, well, my grandparents did it. They spoke to me about this. You are never actually going to understand this on any other comparative side. So I think it's just a far more accessible thing for people comparatively in this side of the debate. They say principally, like, I think the principal argument is just completely unproven. A couple of reasons as to why the grief and sacrifice is a really dangerous weapon for people to have within this country when you make it primarily an aspect of your national pride. One, I think it's just very easy to be weaponized by bad actors. Why is this? One, because when you talk about sacrifice or something that is done, something has been given up, i.e., if someone offers, oh, if you work for an hour and I'll give you €10, or someone offers me €10 just there, I'm probably going to value the €10 I get for the work that I've done, because I've actually had to do something in order to get this. I've had to give up something in order to get this. I've had to sacrifice this in order to get something. So it feels much more valuable to me, so that people can weaponize this and use this kind of sacrifice and use this grief that I've gone through overall. But secondly, it's also, you can weaponize the honor, you can weaponize the family members who had to go through this by saying you are not honoring their legacy. You are not living up to the various different ways in which these people gave up so much for you as a whole. Note, on the comparative, when it's things like language, when it's things like pride, when it's things like the values that you have as a country, you do not weaponize them to the same extent, because it's not something that your family's members went through. But thirdly, I think when they say only you went through this sacrifice, this is part of our national identity, it feels like it's so incredibly important that you have to live up to the sacrifice and the people that came before you overall. I think this manifests itself in various different ways. I think Maya told you about how you can weaponize this on the far right, but I think just like if you think about the granular aspects of a national identity, primarily national identity that is inaccessible, bleeds out in various different ways. For example, it means that children, when they go into school, are unable to contribute to that national identity and feel worse because they aren't the ones who had that family sacrifice, who had that family grief. They feel that they are different to their friends. This is something that compounds over time, whereas comparatively, they can learn the language, they can learn Irish, they can learn the musical instruments. And this is incredibly bad, because as you go on from a young age, you're constantly reminded that you are not part of that specific culture that you went through, because your family member wasn't in the RAF during the Blitz. Your family member didn't go through anything that happened in those specific things. But I think just on the comparative, it's easier to ask back. And I think this impact is quite large within this debate. Why is this? One, because I think the world is becoming a much more multicultural aspect, a multicultural world. So there's many people living in various different countries, will experience various different things. So it's really, really bad. Do I quickly take a closing POI? Opening?
Yeah, so you can also celebrate culture elsewhere. What matters is what we want more of. No national system of identity is going to be completely perfect or encompassing, but I want more truth and reconciliation commissions and cultural reckoning with the past and the horrors of it than pride parades or things that make people feel bad about the ways that their nation hurt their ancestors in the past.
Yeah, but as Josh rightly pointed out to you in his POI, you have a burden to show that you had to uniquely access this through things like national identity, which you haven't done. You mentioned something like the mother and baby homes. Note that the mother and baby homes came from people. The mother and baby homes, and the money that was allocated to the victims of the mother and baby homes, didn't come through something like national identity. It came through people campaigning consistently for truth and reconciliation commissions. At their best, oftentimes happen when it's not part of your national identity. They happen at the time in which, before a national identity actually has a chance to be formed. But I think just why is it really important that we make sure that the national identity is something that is done well? I think because the national identity is something you see every single day. It's something that's emphasized to you by politicians. It's something that emphasized to you at national events. It's the words that happen within your national anthem. It's the meaning that your flag symbolizes for you overall. When this is baked into your national identity, something that you experience constantly, it is a reminder that you have never actually been able to experience or never will be part of your national identity. I think a couple of reasons as to why language and pride and values are the things that come up on the counterfactual. I think one, because they are just the most accessible thing for you there, i.e. they're something that is uniquely linked to your country or national identity as an individualistic thing that you can just quickly seize on. Two, I think they're oftentimes things that people value. It is something that distinguishes them from other people around them or other countries around them. You have the Irish language, or you have the language that was tried to get rid of during colonization, but you didn't in those various different ways. Why do we win this debate? I think we win this debate just one, I think in terms of the severity of impact that the bad aspects of the national identity can have on you as an individual, especially for those who are most vulnerable within societies. I think you can access many benefits of national identity, but I don't think they uniquely have to become through things like sacrifice or things like grief. For all of those reasons, opening government.
I thank DPM for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome up Deputy Leader of the Opposition. Here.
Cool. Can I just check I am audible? Thank you. POIs, please unmute yourself. I'm going to ask specifically where I want the one from closing government, but obviously you don't have to abide by that preference, but Josh, I think we're friends, so I'd like you to do that. Cool. The first question is, where does the framing of national identities come from? Mia tells you that they don't just pop out of the sky, right? They're a product of how leaders behave with each other, how they signal to other individuals. National identities are permanent, not permanent fixtures, but constantly evolving fixtures based on how people respond. As in the notion, what America meant something very different after George Bush stood in the ruins of the 9/11 towers and said that we are all Americans, not just Muslims or white Americans, we all experience this tragedy. So the construction of collective grief occurs through the process of remediation. I want to be very clear then. The idea of the Truth and Reconciliation Committees don't exist in the same way on proposition bench. Counterfactually, no person created the notion of collective guilt or collective suffering. It emerged because of the way people spoke about the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, what people chose to focus on in the COVID-19 inquiry, not the pride of the nurses and how much we should have liked them, but the tragedy of the people that died in nursing homes and the collective tragedy that we all experienced by the failures of lockdown. The framing is very important. Maybe in the accountability of the COVID-19 inquiry would have symmetrical Boris Johnson shit, but the ways in which politicians would have spoken about it, who they have laid the blame against, changes. And that is important for a few reasons. One, the way in which we talk about things massively shapes how all of us behave and think it is appropriate to behave. So national identities shift how we think about victims, how we think about people who are currently victims now, how much deference we give to the notion of grief. These are all things that are important for what I'll weigh later, which is why we just have more of an obligation to protect these victims, acknowledge the harms they've done, not just because they prevent more victims in the harm in the future, but we have a special obligation to those individuals in the first case. The only piece of general weighing I want to do, and this maybe is a bit, bullshittery, but I actually think it's quite persuasive. In the panel what opposition bench looks like. You can point to the Truth and Reconciliation Committee, the COVID-19 inquiry, the fact that we have an armistice on November, we stand up and have a level of silence. Can you ever truly know what the government counterfactual is, what it's going to look like, whether or not it's good or bad? Maybe they prove it to 89%, but you have 100% of the confidence of what these look like on our side, and that certainty is something that government bench can never acquire. What then looks on the counterfactual? I'm going to deal with opening oppositions and then deal with what I think closing governments might be. The first is they say the counterfactual would not isolate immigrants, but unfortunately all of the justifications they provide, like right-wing individuals, the political incentives, the fact that pride is also linked to historical experiences, the fact that culture, parades probably respect or acknowledge historical events, are always going to be exclusionary to immigrants. The notion of national identity is by a nation. If you're an immigrant by nature, you're going to be excluded to a certain extent. The second response is the ability of the sense of exclusion comes from how much you can buy into that narrative. So how is it portrayed? The notion of pride is by its nature exclusionary to people at a far more level. Why? One, pride by its nature accepts the fact that we have things to be prideful of in our history. Oftentimes, throughout the entirety of history, people have done bad things and good things. The notion of being prideful for your history is recognizing and is reducing the validity of the harms that you did in the process of that action. So in the case of the Truth and Reconciliation Committee example, it would be people who fought against apartheid thinking they were specially prideful because unlike other individuals, they actually fought against apartheid and took personal risks. In the case of COVID-19, it'd be like nurses took a special risk or people in care homes took a special risk as opposed to other individuals. This is just not what one sort of pisses people off. The notion that some people are more deserving than others constantly alienates the validation of victims. So even if the notion is we should be prideful and venerate these individuals, whether or not people buy into this interpretation of what victims are depends on how much they want to relate and feel as if they should. The notion of being a collective and the idea that we all have an aspect of grief makes people more likely to acknowledge there is value in talking about another person's grief because another person's grief doesn't trade off against your own, whereas the selective notion of pride on proposition bench does trade up against it. Then they say in 3 levels that I want to flip. The first is any element of pride is always a denial of other people's experiences. So just empirically, if you were prideful of what happened in South Africa, or a Hutu or Tutsi in Rwanda, or something about the COVID-19 inquiry, or the fact that 9/11 occurred and no longer is it a collective aspect of grief, it's a resilience against the future nation. This is by its nature more oppositional. It is more antithetical to the enemy that is outside of us, rather than focusing on the tragedies we have had and the fact that we are common individuals in the pursuit of this. Let's be charitable then, something I'm probably not being at this speech. Let's say it is true that endomization occurs symmetrically. It is unclear why the margin actually changes. Immigrants are likely to be isolated for various reasons they talk about. Margin exists in here. I think the margin to victims is far better. Before I move on then, does closing government have a different counterfactual or not?
I'm not going to answer that, but I'm going to POI something else, which is just post 9/11, thousands of brown people, not just Muslims, experienced hate crimes, violence inflicted upon them just because of the fact that they didn't fit under this. What happens if the suffering is aimed against a specific group?
So I honestly think that the reason people conduct racism, the reason people conduct wars are independent of the notion of national identity. So probably you invaded Iraq for the notion of self-security or for pernicious reasons like wanting to enfranchise our arms industry. I don't think on the most severest instances it has any changing. If the argument from closing government is we like brown people more as a result of the national identity. Look at all the reasons opening government says to why people want to victimize other people in society, right-wing individuals get ahead by having blame game, etc. The actual delta in the round, and the thing that I think is more meaningfully likely to change, is how victims and people who can identify and relate feel about themselves, how they see politicians respecting them. That probably has the more bigger change in the round. Cool. On the two POIs, sorry, the response here from member of government here, I think the difference is, even if you can do it partially on closing government's world, it's having leaders persistently recognize it, and the persistence of that recognition is also the way in which they decide to talk about every issue. So they relate every element of future tragedy to the collective suffering we as a nation have had previously, which means you're persistently reminded that other people have suffered as well. The second is you're also really willing to frame the grief in relation to other individuals. So if you're aware of how many people suffered in World War I, it actually makes you think, well, maybe my suffering isn't that great, which actually is an interesting psychological comparison in order to make individuals better able to deal with their grief and suffering. It also has a lot of tertiary benefits, like we tend to be more deferential to veterans as a result. These individuals fought for us and protected us and oftentimes have destroyed their mental and physical health to provide the freedoms we have today. It implies that we have some obligation to them insofar as they sacrifice more for us than we are currently for them. The last then piece of weighing in is just twofold. The first is, why should we prioritize what happens to victims that have been victimized as opposed to victims that are created in the future? First, we are certain that we've committed a harm against previous individuals. We are certain that they were victims of genocide or that they are victims of other instances. We're unclear how much individuals are going to be harmed in the future and whether they aren't going to. Second, when we do harm against individuals, that's when obligations to remediate that harm are formed. It is unclear if we form an obligation to remediation of future behaviors, because that's not the way obligations emerge. The more certain obligation is to remediate the thing that you have actually caused, rather than the thing that you may potentially cause. So on levels of certainty, you should always prioritize what happens to victims. And I think Mia and I have convincingly shown you that actually we treat victims, that's loud, victims far better as a result of collective notions of grief.
I thank the Ulaw for that speech, and now I'd like to welcome up member of government. Here.
Sorry, I have a split lip, so okay. I would prefer non-verbal POIs because I can see the chat. If I don't, at like 5:55, feel free to interrupt. The case is incredibly simple. When you focus on suffering, you become the monster that you so hard wanted to prevent against hurting you again. The first thing I want to prove is when you focus on suffering, nations that this applies to have a far greater capacity to over-securitize and develop militaries. This is just an empiric bad because it means money that would have been aimed at prevention and reparation is already being spent badly. Firstly, this is just empirically true. Germany, post the Treaty of Versailles, focused massively on the militarization, But secondly, this is also true for Congo, Sudan, and Rwanda, who all post-colonial victories focused on militaries to prevent for other actors within the area finding power as well. Why do you have the incentive to do this? Firstly, you think militarizing and securitizing is the thing that is important to prevent and to protect and prevent reinvasion or to prevent like theft of resources, etc. But secondly, there's a ton of political saliency that comes with this. Opening opposition concedes to this when they say trauma is something that applies to everybody, which means you have the capacity to showcase that this is the way to prevent this trauma again, which means you get widespread buy-in as well. This means two things. Firstly, the people who position themselves as the solution to the suffering and the protection of those who suffered under the suffering are likely to be voted in. But secondly, that they have the mandate to do this at the worst possible way or the most extreme possible way. Secondly, they have the capacity to do this. Even if it's not widespread, you force people to join militaries by building state structures around conscription. See Korea, see Congo, where boys are forced to go into the military at 18 for 2 to 5 years, depending on the country. But secondly, you also have control of the budgets, which means you can allocate a bulk of the resources towards militarization. But thirdly, maybe this is not the greatest mech, but you might just have support from external bad actors like Russia. Russia was sent the Wagner group into Nigeria when it was going through conflict in the 70s and 80s because it wanted access to resources, so it wanted to stoke conflict as well. So it gave the government that won a lot of resources. This is alone enough to win the debate because it means that post-conflict, a lot of the money that would have been allocated towards things like building up resources and state structures are now being allocated towards military in order to prevent, which means there's no comparable benefit from it. And the simple reason for this is, and the simple reason you would spend it on like redevelopment is because you think that this is going to fix the problem and help help people economically advance up. But the better mech here is just, and the reason this is better is because now people have the ability to gain upward mobility. They've got more access to public transport, or they've got access to hospitals to have their instant things dealt with. Even if you buy opening opposition, this money would still be better spent elsewhere, because now on their side it's being spent on these celebrations and these memorials when it doesn't need to be. But per their own framing, this happens yearly at large stages, whereas it could on our side happen initially. But secondly, the reason it's also bad is you condemn the youth to far more death, because now you force them to enlist, or state structures or state narratives like form around the idea that you have a duty to protect your country, which means that kids are encouraged to enlist from an early stage, or you make it mandatory for them to conscript. The problem with state structures forming around militarization is it's hard for them to exit because they think that this is an obligation from them, or they don't have the ability to pivot into higher paying jobs, or they're worried about ridicule, so they stay in the military. This is bad because it means that you live in fear that you are going to be deployed if you ever engage in conflict. But even if you do then engage in conflict, you're fearful about death and you might actually die as a result of this. But secondly, it mobilizes and entrenches corruption within government to a far greater degree. Corrupt actors can use narratives around suffering to entrench their power and exist. The simple reason for this is also given to us quite nicely by opening opposition. This is an incredibly unifying narrative, which means often you can galvanize people to vote for you and get landslide majorities, which means that it's very difficult for opposition to come in, but you control every aspect of the state, which means you can prevent opposition parties from combating you. And the simple reason it's harder for you to hold these corrupt actors to account is because when you win through landslide victories, you entrench systems, like you expand terms like Robert Mugabe did in Zimbabwe, but also it means that you're able to mobilize military to crack down on opposition parties. And the response to this is maybe there'll be backlash as a result of this, but because suffering is such a core part of your identity, it's very easy to frame opposition parties as being anti that, as being anti the majority's interests, which means it's effective to do the corruption as well. You're also able to hide funds more easily because you can showcase that you're spending on types of celebrations, but it's very easy to just add a zero or subtract a zero and put it into your own account and say that you spent it on celebrations or memorials and stuff like that. Why does this alone make you the monster? The first thing is that it removes autonomy and ability to achieve change for a widespread amount of actors, people who oppose these types of systems as well. But it also means that you functionally harm your own people. You take money away that could be allocated towards state rebuilding. You don't give them the ability to have a meaningful say in their voices, and you violate the trust that you had that they gave you. Now onto the very spicy part of the extension. It's very easy for these nations to mobilize against those that you blame for your suffering. Look at what Israel did post-October 8. The reaction was far more disproportionate than any of us can ever believe. And the simple reason for this is you're able to justify it to your populace by showcasing that there is a fear that this is going to happen again. And you wanted to ensure and cripple types of institutions and types of bodies who would react to this. The framing and suffering keeps it alive, and it means that there is a desire for reparations and a desire to have something done about the right that has been done to you, especially when it is suffering, because it's very easy to blame somebody. If you're economically suffering as a country, it's very easy to say this is because of colonial past. If you're like physically suffering because of a bombing, it's very easy to showcase who it was and that there are other actors that support you as well. There is a perception of necessity that you have to attack other nations for two reasons. Firstly, because if you advance forward, you protect yourself, and it means that they don't have the ability to get to important resources first. So things like water, things like minerals, you have the ability to protect. But secondly, it means that you have the ability to strike first and prevent additional structures. So this is what like Israel did post-October 8. They struck to Lebanon and other neighboring nations because they wanted to cripple the institutions and the bodies there that would potentially hurt them because of the initial attack, which means there was a perception that they had to go big or go home because otherwise the other bodies would attack them more. Why does this make you the monster? But before that, I'll take a POI from OO.
So pride can also be mobilized for collective defense, right? We are strong people worth defending. We have historically been successful in mobilized.
I'm getting to the comparative part of it, but like for the sake of our joke, next question. Why does this make you the monster? The first reason is it means that you have caused the wide-scale death of other people and you've advanced suffering that have happened to others. And given you have suffered and you frame this as like trying to protect and prevent, then you have become like a bad thing. But secondly, it means you've just caused the death of your own people who've already experienced some large amounts of conflicts. Those who die in the conflict that you caused have now died because you focused on this. But secondly, those that die in the conflict that is caused by external actors because they want to prevent against, which is what Russia did with Ukraine, those have died because of the fact that they perceived Ukraine as becoming more of a military threat as a result of this. How do you prevent this on the comparative? Here's William's POI's relevance. The first thing is that on the comparative, per Ayal's POI to OG and what OG says, there are far more individual narratives that form around state identity. So it's not one specific event that happened to you, but rather things like your language, things like individual history, things like US freedom and desires for that, which means that each person finds differing degrees of success and different degrees of importance to that. So they latch onto it to a far greater degree, which means it's far harder to mobilize a critical mass in order to do things like militarization and corruption to this degree. But secondly, the obsession and the motivation that you have on opposition is far on government is far weaker when it isn't the thing that is formed around core identities. And this people who don't grow up thinking that they're already at a disadvantage because of the location that they live. They're not already at a disadvantage because of the previous events that happened, like when US invaded Iraq, etc. This means that people just have far less of an obsession with it and are far less inclined to want to support it as well. In terms of scale, I think we won the debate, but it also just proves that the scale of violence is unlikely to happen.
Right. I thank the member of government for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up the member of opposition. Here.
Am I clearly visible and audible? Cool. I'll begin my speech in 3, 2, 1. We're going to explain why the counterfactuals are all worse at creating national unity. They create more hate. They lead to more conflict, both early on as well as down the line. Secondly, we're going to explain how this is useful as a long-standing narrative about national identity to encourage people to sacrifice for the collective. Starting with the first argument. Note that OO don't say much about the comparative. They say that it's patchwork and it's likely done badly because the majority enforce their own preference. We're going to explain what a likely counterfactual is, and yes, it does follow the majority enforcing their preference, I guess, but it's a lot more concrete and a lot more impactful. We think it's likely to have direct hate of a given group. Why is this likely? Oftentimes you need the other in order to define the self, and you have an incentive to unify, in particular in the face of the other. Being a Catholic in Ireland wasn't a meaningful source of identity until Protestant elites arrived, and suddenly that was a meaningful distinction. Before that, the meaningful distinction would have been a tribe-based identity, and you're othering the other based on tribes. Secondly, oftentimes you're founded through war with a direct given opponent, who's often your neighbor. Think about Eritrea, Somaliland, or Armenia, who are founded in a war against their strong neighbor who's going to stay there. But secondly, even when you were founded through an independence war from the Brits, competing ethnicities had to fight together and then against each other with their local neighbors. Think about India versus Pakistan. Think about Israel and Palestine. They were competing for the vacuum that the Brits created. These people remain your neighbors over time. Ethnic cleansing do lead to borders, but they have continued hate, continued land disputes, and continued minorities living in the other side despite the massive ethnic cleansings, meaning that there's continued opportunities for inflammation. Finally, it's likely because it's intrinsically easy to feel and describe. It's easy to campaign on with little pushback when you're hating your neighbor or a minority within your country. There's an intrinsic negativity, bias, and fear that we have of the other. It creates more warmongering, more of a sectarian divide. Finally, it allows politicians to shed responsibility. This is especially true if there's a true risk, but even this is like just having an accessible, available minority to hate on lets you pretend there's a risk and fearmonger. Why is grief a uniquely overpowering narrative that prevents this counterfactual? Note the motion defines it as happening primarily. It just ends up being dominant, and these all trade off with each other and with this one. But secondly, we think that establishing strong narratives of grief and collective action requires effort. OO are right to mention the TRCs, memorials, and investigations. This investment entrenches the narrative. We think that investment prevents the worst counterfactuals. Finally, though, narratives have tipping points and network effects. If everyone is engaging in a narrative, it becomes very easy to engage in it, and it becomes dominant. We think that on the comparison, either this one isn't dominant, which means that either you have no dominance or the hatred is dominance. Leading me to the second alternative within this case, many counterfactuals that compete with each other. Maybe it's religion, land, hate of the other, ethnic, linguistic, tribal. It's just about what unifies you and distinguishes you internally. It's incredibly sectarian. This is incredibly othering. Every single one of these alternatives is othering to some portion of the people living within the country. Think of Syria. What is it going to be about? Is it about religion? Some people think so. They think it's Sunni. It's bad for Christians. It creates conflict against them. Is it about ethnicity? That's bad for Jews and creates conflict against them. Is it political? Some Syrians think that being Syrian is about socialism. It's about Islamism. It's about pan-Arabism. These people are in continued conflict against each other, unable to unify, meaning that the worst militants end up taking over them. All of these end up competing. It's harmful. It means that you don't have any unity. Let's unpack this first argument. Number one, this increases the odds of internal hate. It furthers ethnic cleansing, apartheid laws, or ghettoization. Note, people fear this before the country is even founded. The minority fears it when the ethos is not built around what it is on our side, but instead on fear, on hatred of the other, or on independent identity groupings. This means that in the first place, people fight back more and you have more tense initial creations. It then also leads, secondly, to hatred and tensions with your neighbor. Think about Iraq and Iran or India and Pakistan. These are religious-based national identities. This reduces the that means that they're in direct competition with each other, and there are minorities of the opposite religion in each one that are being religiously oppressed. This reduces interstate trade and cultural exchange. It increases hatred and tension. It decreases the diffusionary tools and incentives that these countries have because they have less bilateral trade, less bilateral engagement and diplomatic talks. It also increases the opportunities for inflammation, i.e. the cross-border retribution to the inner border crimes towards minorities, i.e. for Hindus killing Muslims in India. Finally, this worsens politics. Politicians have an easier time ignoring their responsibilities because they can blame the other ad infinitum, and it's easier for cruel or fear-mongering or strongman populist politicians to get elected. Not only are those views in themselves bad, but the rest of those views that those people have and bring to the table are also bad. Before I move on to my second argument, POI, OG.
Many of the ways in which you say like exclusionary happens on our side of the house as well, because you have access. Like grief happens because of what other countries have done to you. Shared sacrifice happens to what other countries have done to you. But you can also use the mechanisms that we gave you in our speech as to why politicians can weaponize that against you.
Yeah, but opening opposition counter assert that the sacrifice and grief are far more universal. I think that that's far more intuitive. In other words, even if this is somewhat true, this is a mitigation, and obviously it's far less true on our side than on your side. Let's talk about long-term utility. We encourage people to sacrifice for the collective. This looks like taxes, volunteer work, and enlistment. Past narratives encourage people to do action now and follow it now. People care about their national identity. 10% are super nationalistic and care a lot about their national identity. But all of us are exposed to it in school. Repeat exposure from a young age, from figures of authority that entrenches itself in the national songs and hymns and icons and whatnot. People then seek to emulate these values. Why? Because I've internalized that this is what it means to be a good person and a good citizen of my country. Secondly, because I believe that I can gain social and societal capital by manifesting these national ethos and goals, manifesting sacrifice for the collective, answering this need well. Finally, I seek to emulate the role models, the figures of national mythos who represent whatever the primary framing of national identity is. The people who put in the most sacrifice, the most grief, or are most representative of it. What are the concrete contributions people give more? Number one, it's taxes. We get less tax evasion, less tax avoidance, also more charity. These are things many people engage in, and there's a limit to our capacity to crack down on them. It's good if people engaged in it less. It would also make our crackdowns more efficient because we'd have fewer people we need to try and catch for tax evasion. Secondly, volunteer work. You're more likely to join the local volunteer firefighters or community watch, or even just the local volunteer sports group. Like engage more with your community in various positive ways. Finally, it encourages people to enlist and fight for their country. This is often crucial. National projects are aimed for national protection of a people living in a land. The will of Afghanis to fight versus flee, their will to fight being too low, led to the Taliban rising back. Lebanon's lack of unity makes the Lebanese military not even the strongest military in Lebanon, and other armies LARP around in them. On the flip side, on GovBench, you encourage people to engage with whatever the counterfactual narrative is. You make them care way too much about religion or ethnic history and culture or ideology, or worst of all, direct hatred of their neighbors. Think about Turks and Greeks that just LARP around about how much they hate each other. We think that's harmful. This also flips OG on minorities, but I don't have time for that. So for all these reasons, closing opposition.
I thank the member of opposition for that speech, and I'd like to welcome up Government. Here.
Give me one sec. Cool. I'll take a POI from opening somewhere midway through my speech. Human history is a story of tragedies committed in the name of justice and security. We say the obsession with grief means you do awful things in order to prevent it. Let's start by talking about how this is internalized. Firstly, responding to opening opposition, who say you're going to internalize this in a lovely way that's very introspective and looks at things like truth and reconciliation committees. We say the way you internalize it is you find those to blame for causing the grief and forcing the sacrifice. There's two reasons why this is true. Firstly, that it often just are people who cause this. As others mentioned, often this is the cause of foreign wars or oppressive groups economically harming you, and it's perfectly fair to think those are the people who are the cause of it. Secondly, you want to blame others, and there's a few sub-reasons for this. Firstly, you don't want it to believe your grief or your sacrifice was a random thing, but rather it was the fault of someone, right? There was a cause. It was not just some speculative thing that randomly occurred. Secondly, you're either pushed into this or you might have existing biases. And I know these things do exist. We think the grief makes them vastly worse. At the point where you have this grief that's very deeply entrenched in your identity, and you then attach that to pre-existing biases you may have against an already greater group, vastly increases the hate you feel towards them. But finally, it's simply far better than blaming the self. What opening opposition talk about is that we all consider the role we played in the suffering, or the fact that it was a fact all of us not acting enough that caused the suffering. This is an incredibly difficult thing to have to mentally cope with, that you might be partly to blame, or that someone you love or someone within your group might be partly to blame. It's far easier to look towards to some other group, and say this was the cause instead. This is why then is we think that is the way you internalize it, and I think this inherently responds to a large amount of opening opposition. On back half, I will admit this might get messy, but closing opposition say is that you instead, absent this identity, you form another form of identity that probably also causes conflict and also causes you to hate others. I have a few reasons why our grief-premised form of hate is probably worse than their general form of hatred and discrimination between identities. Firstly, as they point out, there is a range of counterfactuals. So at the point where we prove that the grief opportunity and the sacrifice version inherently does lead to the hatred towards others, and there is a vast number of other counterfactuals, some of which may cause hate, some of which may not cause hate, we are more certain on our side of the house. Secondly, in grief-based forms of identity, you can point to very specific forms of suffering. You can point towards your grandfather who died in the war, or the person who starved to death because the food was taken away from you. It's not an abstract that person is different from me, but rather the sacrifice and the grief that I've been taught and told about every day and every celebration and every memorial is specifically the fault of that group, and that is which has been internalized against me. Thirdly, I would say that while you perhaps do need to define yourself, well, actually, I'd challenge that first of all. I don't think you necessarily do need to define yourself against others on our side of the house. I think I think Americans can enjoy the fact that they feel free or feel American without defining that against Canadianism, for example, right? I think we can have inherent value in, for example, the art or music or food we create, the beauty of our language and things like this, or just the beauty of the land in which we live without defining that against someone else. But thirdly, I would say it's not definitionally true that when you have differences, these differences need to lead to conflict. Now, notably, we will prove very clearly why differences based on the belief that someone caused your grief or caused your sacrifice do necessarily lead to this. But a difference in how I am versus how someone else is doesn't necessarily mean I need to hurt that person. It may mean I exclude them. That's perfectly fair. But it doesn't mean I actively need to go after them and cause harm. And that's what we will exclusively prove in closing government. The second burden I had here was that national identity triggers these things vastly more. I think this is something all of the teams in this debate kind of concede at the point where they talk about the influence it has in politics and society. There's a few sub-reasons for it. Once it's part of your identity, the grief gets very heavily reinforced. You have those annual memorials, you have those speeches, the soldiers get rolled out in assemblies at schools and TV shows and things like that. Secondly, it becomes but I think it's just important, it becomes a betrayal of the identity. So that when you stand against the war, or you stand against the security that is meant to prevent that grief from occurring again, you're being un-American, you're being un-German, you're being un-Russian, all of those labels that get thrown against someone that inherently removes them from the debate, that feels like their contributions for peace or anti-discrimination are not legitimate in the eyes of what society as a whole should be perceiving these things as. What then does this push us towards? And I want to note, I think this happens both top down and bottom up. Because I think one of the generic replies we get towards this is, well, there's incentives to go to war, there's incentives to discriminate, elites will do this anyway. Firstly, we think part of this is that elites weaponize this. It's much easier for them not to be held to account, much easier for them to say, we need to do this, prevent the grief or prevent the tragedy. But I think a lot of the time it's bottom up. I think a lot of the time, as much as we might want to blame politicians, it's us in society who cry for the war or cry for the hatred because we feel that same grief, because we're so obsessed with it never happening again. First reason way this manifests, as Josh points out, is a security obsession. That this grief has been done onto us in the past, and we ought never go through it again. See, for example, the century of humiliation narrative in China, I think is a good example of this. The awful things our nation has endured, we should not have to endure once more. This means, one, you invest massively in things like defense, because you don't want to ever be in the weak position to have sacrifice needed and demanded from you in the past. This is bad, because I think all the other things the government spend money on is much better. healthcare, food, all of these things, but also just because it often looks like things like conscription, which rip people's freedoms away from them and force them to go into an often traumatizing and demeaning form of service. But we'll take the much higher burden. We think this often leads to attacks upon others. There's a few examples of this. Firstly is just invasions. William wants to talk about 9/11 as a good example. I think 9/11 was one of the greatest disasters in the modern era because of how the US reacted to it when it became a core part of its national identity. The invasions that occurred in the Middle East. Secondly, it's escalating tensions. See the way France and Germany in the late 19th century, after the Franco-Prussian War and the taking of Alsace-Lorraine, developed into increasing tensions and combat that eventually led to the First World War. And thirdly is discrimination within your country, i.e. the Soviet mass killings of German-speaking civilians post-World War II and things like this as a result. Why did this happen? Before that, opening.
Grief is universalizing. When people see how everyone suffered, this makes them less likely to support military actions because we have been drilled into us that this only causes universal suffering.
But you don't think your grief is equal to someone else's. The fact that you lost your grandfather or lost someone that you deeply love, you don't think someone else is ever equal to that, especially when you think they're the one who's caused it. The reason why this manifests in a conflict is firstly, you think something must be done. You want action. Secondly, you want justice. Someone else should suffer because I have suffered, because my family has suffered. But thirdly, you think they may attack again in future, i.e. you think there probably are more terrorists in the Middle East that are coming to do a second 9/11, and you think we must act now to prevent this from ever being realized. What are the impacts now of this? Firstly, deaths. Across human history, likely tens or hundreds of millions of people have been killed, crippled, disfigured, or trapped in poverty through the conflicts that we prove happen. But importantly, this becomes secular. Because what you do unto them then becomes their grief and their sacrifice. It becomes the rallying cry for the next war, for the next act of discrimination, for the next genocide. And so this constantly keeps happening once again until no one is left. Why should you weigh this over the experience of previous victims? One, you can't undo their harm. I'm very unclear as to what celebrating or remembering does to remove the tragedies that they have gone through, whereas we have active tragedies in the future. But secondly, despite what William says, clearly not hurting people is a greater moral imperative than repaying those we have hurt. Because if it wasn't, then there wouldn't be a moral crime in hurting them in the first place. Panel, there are centuries and millennia of warfare that have been choreographed through this form of identity. That's what we stand against closing government. That's what we're very proud to oppose.
I thank the government whip for that speech, and now I'd like to talk about opposition whip. Here.
Can you hear me and see me? Sorry. Okay, yes. Just give me a moment here. Before I go on to the speech, I just want to say that me and Ayala are doing this from Canada. We are happy that you have welcomed us to your competition. It is very late for me. I've been up for a long time, but I will see you at Euros IAing. Please chair me maybe if you have it in your hearts, and I will be less sleepy. Okay. This entire debate lacks a comparative. It lacks comparative analysis. Everyone is flippant with what they are providing, and it makes the debate very unclear. Ayala wins this debate very clearly by proving that the counterfactual is likely that there is going to be hate levied against the outgroup, either as one dominant hateful narrative or as many different narratives that all manifest in hateful ways, see sectarian conflict. We then tell you that the collective sacrifice and grief narrative crowds out this counterfactual, allows for pro-social identity formation. Hate is bad. Sectarianism is bad. It increases things like apartheid, oppression. It causes negative polarization in politics. It makes politicians less accountable for their policies. It makes trade across states harder. It makes commerce harder. It makes economic growth harder. This creates structural friction in institutions. It also nudges people towards taking the worst excesses. I think CG agrees with us here. I'm going to respond to them very explicitly. But first, let me weigh this above opening opposition. We think that victim closure is not the most important consideration in this debate for two reasons. Firstly, is that victim closure is speculative. So yes, you might get TRCs and you might get memorials. These are good, but they provide land acknowledgements. They make people feel seen. They don't write history. They don't right the wrongs of the past. Nothing actually changes. So maybe some people do feel seen by these gestures, but it doesn't actually mean that they're day-to-day life is better off. Whereas entrenched hatred, poses an active, ongoing harm, which we actually prevent on our side of the house. The second reason is that we just have a much larger impact that affects many more people. So the problems we've identified with creating or entrenching hateful narratives affect people across the entire nation. It makes the entire nation less able to grow in effective ways.
You're right.
We think that's bad, but it also doubly hurts the people who are the most likely to be victimized or entrenched. Like immigrants are going to be hurt by this the most because if the country overall is less functional, less trusting, less economically developed, then they're also worse off as a result. Before I go on to the gov bench, I'll take the POI.
Yeah, but the problem is you amplify the ability to entrench hatred on your side by telling people that the reason they should hate those that did it, the reason they should hate others is because it caused the suffering that they have. This is why South Africa is seeing a swing back towards anti-white people rhetoric now.
All right, so we do get some good responses from CG. I'll get into that right now. The first response we get is that grief is one narrative that is likely to lead to hate, whereas our comparative is that there are many different narratives and they are maybe going to lead to hate, which makes like grief more certain, is like what we get from the government whip. This misunderstands our case. Our analysis explains that all of the potential counterfactuals are going to be unified by their use of hate and by the use of otherism. So I don't think this, flippant piece of weighing stands. The second thing they try to explain is that we are going to remember grief in ways that make us hate others. The first problem with this claim is that I think it ignores half of the motion, like collective sacrifice. When you are nation building, when you are working really hard, when you're like fighting revolutions, etc., those are not tied to grief. And so all of their analysis on this front just does not apply. But secondly, dealing directly with grief. Grief is not hate. The emotion of grief is not hate. It doesn't imply hate anywhere. When my grandfather died, I grieved for many weeks. I was not hateful at the world. I did not hate God. I did not hate disease. I was grieving. The issue here is that they have a positive burden to prove that this grief will lead to hate. Their reasoning on this is to say that people will remember. The issue is that this is unlikely, or at least less likely than what we propose, because grievances fade. People forget. Generations die off. The difference is that with our counterfactual, you can use otherism and you can use the fear of the other forever. It is never going to die off because it is always a future speculative, remember that like grievance that happened in the past? Well, they're going to do something worse in the future. We need to make sure that we ourselves are identified in opposition to those individuals. And it's not reliant on the direct tie to something that happened to you. It's more reliant on the way that narratives form. The issue with closing government as a whole is that they are not comparative. Josh tells us that like this causes militarism. This causes further entrenchment of hatred, but it's completely uncomparative. I don't understand why on their side of the house, the counterfactual is not super hatred or super militarism. We get no analysis to this point. They get 1 minute in the member of government, rather, saying that the counterfactual is that there will be individual narratives that exist and that they will be weaker patchwork narratives. This is unlikely for a few reasons. Firstly, leaders want to have a strong national identity. It is good because it makes it easy to recruit people for like the military. It shows that your political party stands for something. It allows you to define yourself oppositionally within the political circuit domestically. Thirdly, it can be used to levy your individual interests. So it's something that you want to do. And fourthly, why the fuck, as a leader of a nation, would you allow patchwork narratives to dominate the ecosystem? Why wouldn't you make sure that your idea, your conception of the nation is the conception that dominates? We've seen this across the world. For example, Saddam building statues to like the Ba'athist nationalist identity. These things happen everywhere. Leaders like to create dominant narratives. No. And so we tell you that when they're using, when grief is used on our side of the house, it crowds out the worst forms of these excesses. It makes people's lives much better. What do we get from OG? OG similarly misses the counterfactual. They tell us that the likely counterfactual is culture, that people are going to like have language and instruments, and this is good. They tell you that this is quick to seize on and that people can access it very easily. I've already taken down closing government's conception of this, which I think cross applies to opening government. But I also just want to note that a lot of their analysis cuts into their terminal impact, right? Like for an immigrant who is coming to the United States, for example, an Iraqi translator who helped the US military, they are able on our side of the house to buy into the narratives of collective sacrifice, of working hard, etc. But if language is the metric by which you buy into a culture, you have an accent. You're always going to be an outsider. You're never going to be able to fit in. Panel, I think this debate had a problem. The problem is that everyone presumed that the counterfactual would be what best fits with their case. It'll be a patchwork. Oh no, it'll be something worse. We're the only team in this debate to provide a litany of strong reasons for why the counterfactual is so much worse. We tell you that this specific narrative, while not perfect, is something that allows for pro-social conceptions of the state to form. It crowds out the worst harms that could possibly occur. It means that nations are able to develop in much more productive ways. This is the largest impact in this debate. This is the most certain impact in this debate. This is an impact that lasts for the longest amount of time because it can be used forever and forever and forever. We avoid that. We oppose.